Amidst the clanging of dishes, Alex's voice cut through sharply, demanding, "Alara, bring me some tea now." I paused, my hands submerged in the water, and replied, "Hold on, I'm doing the dishes." His tone was filled with disbelief and impatience. "Stop that and bring me the tea quickly. Can't you follow simple orders?" I tried to explain, but, only to be cut off again. "What a useless wife you are." Suddenly, Mrs. Whitmore, my mother-in-law, chimed in from the living room. "Make me some sweet coffee, please," as she lounged, enjoying a cake she had taken from the fridge, malice flickering in her eyes. I glanced at the towering stack of dishes and sighed. There are so many. But their voices insisted, "Leave them for later. Just do what we say, useless wife." Alex's tone felt like a whip, stinging with each word. At 28, I was a working mother named Alara, trapped in a marriage that felt more like a prison. Married at 23, I had sought love and partnership, but found myself under Alex's thumb and his domineering mother's grip. Our only child, a 4-year-old son, was the sole source of joy in my otherwise bleak existence. Living in Alex's family home was portrayed as necessary to care for Mrs. Whitmore after my father-in-law's passing. Initially, I pitied her so-called grief, but soon, it was evident I was merely a pawn in her cruel domestic tyranny. Cooking, cleaning, working, it was never enough. My efforts were met with disdain, my meals criticized harshly or left uneaten. "The stir-fry is so half-hearted," Mrs. Whitmore would scoff. "Cook it properly from scratch." "I'm busy and can only make simple things," I'd reply, striving to maintain a steady voice. Her disdainful snap would follow. "That's why I hate backtalk from a daughter-in-law. Cook from scratch." I once dared to retort, "Why don't you cook then if you're such a good cook?" but immediately regretted it. Icy and dismissive, she responded, "Why would I do housework when you're here? Are you out of your mind?" Their cruelty worsened over time, shifting from harshness to an eerie silence, treating me like a ghost haunting my own home. From undervalued, I had become invisible over time. 5 years elapsed in this suffocating atmosphere, Alex aging to 33 while I was 35, our son growing up, yet the oppressive air persisted. Mrs. Whitmore, now 63, seemed to thrive on my misery. One evening, as I trudged home, a heavy realization hit me. To them, I was a mere shadow, unseen, unheard. The only voice acknowledging me was my son's, and the thought of losing even that was unbearable. Returning home, I immediately began cooking, trying to push away the gloom. I prepared mapo tofu, fried chicken, and a stir-fry with bell peppers and pork, striving for normalcy at our dinner. Suddenly, Alex broke his long silence with a command, "Bring me the mayo," not with gratitude or conversation, but an order, marking the final straw in my patience. It worsened that evening when Mrs. Whitmore demanded, "Clean the toilet." "What now?" I gasped. "Yes, now," she insisted, voice dripping venom. My frustration boiled over. "Don't say such things while we're eating. It's nasty, like your heart," she hissed back. Alex insisted I apologize, but for the first time, I stood my ground and refused. In that peak conflict, a decision crystallized within me. I needed to escape this toxic environment, not just for myself, but for my son. Retreating to my room, my resolve hardening, I downloaded and filled out divorce papers, slamming them in front of Alex. His palpable shock did nothing to deter my cold determination. "I'm filing these," I declared steadily. Facing my husband's bewildered expression, I realized I had stepped out from the shadows. It was time to reclaim my life. In the aftermath of my divorce declaration, their cold glares and biting remarks were a whirlwind. Amid this storm, I found an unfamiliar sense of liberation. One evening, serving dinner, Mrs. Whitmore looked at the meal with disdain. "You call this food? Even a child cooks better," eliciting me to remain silent, focusing on my son's smile. "Eat up, sweetheart, I made your favorite tonight." Alex, with sarcasm, chimed in. "Oh, playing the perfect mother now, are we?" Anger bubbled inside, yet I composedly replied, I'm just trying to make a nice dinner for our son. Mrs. Whitmore snorted. Don't act high and mighty. You're just a burden here. The tension at the table was thick. Alex's attempts to belittle me intensified. So, Alara, have you thought about how you'll survive the divorce? You can barely keep a house, let alone your own life. Meeting his gaze unfalteringly, I responded, I've supported this family for years. I'm not worried about taking care of myself and our son. His smirk wavered slightly, unease flickering in his eyes. Mrs. Whitmore interjected quickly. Don't be absurd. You need us more than we need you. The conversation shifted to finances, a typically avoided topic. Without my salary, this household crumbles, I stated, more to myself. Mrs. Whitmore scoffed. We can manage. We don't need your pity money, but Alex's silence confirmed the truth. Without my income, they would be in dire straits. Their behavior grew erratic in the following days. Mrs. Whitmore oscillated between trying to sweet-talk me into staying and hurling insults when I didn't comply. Alex, meanwhile, appeared lost, his arrogance faltering as his financial dependence became undeniable. One afternoon, I overheard a chilling conversation between them. She can't leave us like this, Alex hissed. We need her money. Mrs. Whitmore's coldly calculated reply came. Don't worry, I have a plan. We'll make her life so miserable she won't dare to leave. Hearing their true intentions revealed that it wasn't about me or our son, but control and money. That night, a plan formed in my mind. If they wanted a battle, I'd give them one. Not with words or petty arguments, but by hitting where it hurt the most. Their pride in pockets, I reached out to a highly recommended lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman. I'm looking for a divorce, I confided, and I want to ensure they don't get a penny more than they deserve. With a determined glint in her eyes, she assured me, we'll make sure of that. You've been the sole provider, right? We'll use that. As days passed, my determination grew. I documented everything. The insults, the financial manipulation, even minor grievances. It was time to turn the tables. They had to face the consequences. As I built my case, a sense of empowerment filled me. After years, I felt in control of my destiny. The shadows of contempt were lifting, and a new dawn was upon me. As the divorce proceedings started, the atmosphere at home turned toxic, but each day my fear gave way to a steely resolve. One evening, Mrs. Whitmore attempted a different approach. Alara, dear, let's forget this nasty business. We're family, she cooed insincerely. I met her unwaveringly. Family doesn't treat each other as you have treated me. Alex, quietly observing, sneered. Playing the victim, are you? You're not as innocent as you pretend. Filled with anger, I remained calm. I'm not playing anything, Alex. I'm simply refusing to be your scapegoat anymore. Our conversations often turn to finances. You think you can just take our son and leave? How will you support him? Alex challenged. I smiled with confidence. I've supported this family for years. I'll be fine. Mrs. Whitmore sneered. You're nothing without us. You'll come crawling back, but their words held no power. I knew my worth and the truth. The next day, I met my lawyer again, and she outlined our strategy, exposed their financial dependency on me. It would be crucial for custody and assets. Feeling vindicated, I nodded. Legalities were on my side, and I was ready to fight. At home, tension peaked. Mrs. Whitmore's attempts to undermine grew desperate. You think you're so smart, she spat. You're abandoning your family, cold-hearted woman. I replied, steady and firm. No, I'm standing up for myself. Alex interjected venomously. You'll regret this. You can't survive without me. But his threats fell on deaf ears. Intimidation no longer worked. As days advanced, I prepared for the court battle, gathering financial statements, recording verbal abuse, collecting evidence of their negligence. While organizing documents one afternoon, my son asked, Mom, are we going to be okay? I hugged him protectively. Yes, sweetheart, we'll be fine. We'll leave and start a new, happy life. His arms tightened around me, confirming my decision. I was fighting for both our futures. As the court date loomed, impending freedom was within reach. I was ready to face Alex and Mrs. Whitmore and their reign of control and reclaim my life, giving my son the happiness he deserved. It was time for justice. On the day of the hearing, a day filled with dread and determination, I sat across from them, feeling surreal. This was the turning point. Proceedings began formally. Alex's lawyer portrayed him as a wrongly accused husband and father, Mrs. Whitmore as a wronged mother-in-law. But their performance lacked substance. Their lies were fragile. When my turn came, I spoke steadily. I've been the sole provider for years. My husband's unemployment and his mother's manipulation are consistent strains. Alex interjected. Alara, how could you say this? I've always supported you. I faced him firmly. Support is more than words, Alex. Your actions are selfish and cruel. The judge listened intently as I presented evidence. Financials, recordings of verbal abuse, neighbor testimonies. The truth couldn't be denied. With evidence mounting, Alex's facade crumbled, Mrs. Whitmore's composure shattered. Then, the revelation sealing their fate, my lawyer presented proof of Alex's infidelity and Mrs. Whitmore's illicit affair with their neighbor, Mr. Harwood, in compromising photos. Despite her shrill protests about invasion of privacy, their deceit was exposed. No, I said calmly. Truths concealed too long have been unveiled. The damage done, their credit shattered, lies exposed in the courtroom's harsh light. As proceedings concluded, the judge granted me full custody of our son and a fair asset division. Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were left with tarnished reputations. Outside the courtroom, freed from years of abuse, I embraced my son. We did it, Mom, he exclaimed joyfully. Yes, I replied. We're free now. As we walked away hand in hand, this wasn't just my victory. It was a victory for anyone who's been made to feel small, powerless, or unworthy. Justice and truth marked the onset of an optimistic new chapter, heralding a future full of promise. The court ruling left immediate chaos in its wake, revealing the deceit of Alex and Mrs. G.W. Whitmore and sullying their reputations in our close-knit community. Their facade of respectability shattered. They could no longer hide. In the few days following the verdict, my energy was directed toward rebuilding my life with my son. Despite this, I couldn't shake a sense of fulfillment from realizing that Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were now accountable for their deception. One evening, as I prepared dinner, an unexpected visitor arrived, Mrs. Harwood, Mr. Harwood's wife. Her eyes were red, tears unshed. Alara, she began, her voice breaking, I've heard everything. I can't believe Sylvia, Mrs. Whitmore, did this. Seated at my kitchen table over a cup of tea, she poured out her sorrow. I trusted her as a neighbor, as a friend, and she was having an affair with my husband. I offered comfort, listening as the betrayal laid bare became evident. The damage Mrs. Whitmore's actions inflicted was beyond what she foresaw. The following day, I ran into Alex in town. The once arrogant man was now just a shadow of himself, defeat replacing his previous arrogance. Alara, can we talk? He asked, his voice a mere whisper. What is there to discuss, Alex? I inquired, facing him squarely. He fidgeted, struggling to meet my gaze. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't know how much I relied on you, on your strength. His apology, though overdue, signified his realization and loss, his dignity, his home, his family. It was, however, Mrs. Whitmore who faced the gravest repercussions. Her affair led to not just a damaged reputation but legal complications, with Mrs. Harwood filing for divorce and pursuing charges of alienation of affection. Whispers and rumors painted a portrait of Mrs. Whitmore as a woman undone by her deeds. She became an outcast, shunned by those she called friends. I saw her one afternoon at the grocery store, her eyes lowered as if to avoid prying glances. Our eyes locked momentarily, a mix of resentment and defeat visible in hers. You did this to me, she hissed as she passed by. Watching her fading silhouette, I felt both pity and vindication. No, Sylvia, you did this to yourself, I murmured inwardly. The scales of justice had tipped, and Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were trapped in the consequence-laden reality sown by their own manipulation and deceit. Seeing them struggle in this aftermath, I understood that the greatest revenge was simply to live well, unhindered by their toxicity. Shifting my focus back to my son and our new lives, I realized ours wasn't a narrative of vengeance, but of newfound freedom from control and abuse. As I foresaw the future's boundless possibilities, I knew the best days lay ahead. Despite the echoes of Alex's voice sharply demanding, "Alara, bring me tea," I remained focused on my present task, washing dishes. "I'm busy with the dishes, hold on," I called back. "Stop and bring it now. Can't you follow simple orders?" His tone incredulous, tainted with impatience. From the living room, Mrs. Whitmore, my mother-in-law, chimed in with demand too. "Bring me some sweet coffee, please." She lounged, savoring a purloined fridge cake slice, her eyes gleaming with malice. Suppressing a weary sigh, I glanced at the piling dishes. "Leave them. Just do as we say, useless wife." Alex's words were like a lash, each syllable stinging. At 28, a working mother, my life felt as constricting as a prison, married at 23 with hopes of love and companionship that eroded into a life tethered to Alex and his domineering mother. Our 4-year-old son was my sole joy amidst this bleak existence. Living in Alex's parental home was a forced decision under the guise of attending to Mrs. Whitmore, grieving as a widow. Yet soon revealed, was I not just a pawn in her domestic tyranny, cooking, cleaning, working beyond suffice, my meals untouched, criticized harshly. "This stir-fry is half-hearted. Do it from scratch," she'd scoff. "Busy and pressured," I'd reason. "I can only make simple things." Her retort was sharp. "That's why I hate back-talk. Cook properly. Why don't you?" My rare retort met ice. "Why would I? You're here, aren't you?" Over time, harsh words gave way to chilling silence, rendering me ghost-like in my own home, visibly invisible. Years passed. Alex aged alongside me while our son blossomed, yet a stifling atmosphere persisted. My mother-in-law, at 63, thrived on my discomfort. One weary evening, coming home from work, the weight of feeling insignificant gnawed at me. Shadows of doubt about my value loomed, but my son's small, cherubic voice grounded me. The mere thought of losing even this recognition unbearable. Returning, I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing mapo tofu, fried chicken, a pepper and pork stir-fry, seeking normalcy amidst dissonance. "Bring the mayo." Alex suddenly broke silence. Compliant and tired, I obliged, handing it over without gratitude received. His first words in ages, just orders, not acknowledgement, my patience reaching its boundary. Evenings soured further as Mrs. Whitmore demanded, "Clean the toilet." Now, rendered me aghast. Her persistence, "Yes, now," dripped with venom. In futile resistance, I retorted, frustration spilling through, breaking free from suppressive chains. As the meal was being served, Mrs. Whitmore sneered at the plate, expressing disdain. "Is this what you call food? Even a child could cook better." I held my tongue, focusing instead on my son's cheerful expression. "Eat up, sweetheart. I made your favorite tonight." Alex's sarcasm cut through the air. "Oh, playing the perfect mother now, are we? What a joke." Despite the anger simmering inside, I maintained my calm. "I'm just trying to prepare a nice meal for our son," I replied. Mrs. Whitmore didn't miss a beat, snorting. "Don't act high and mighty. You're just a burden in this house." The tension around the table was undeniable, magnified by Alex's attempts to belittle me further. "So, Alara, have you thought about how you'll survive after the divorce? You can barely manage a house, let alone your life." I met his gaze squarely, asserting, "I've been the one supporting this family for years. I can take care of both myself and our son." His confident smirk faltered slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Mrs. Whitmore quickly interjected, "Don't be ridiculous. You need us far more than we need you." When the conversation inevitably shifted to finances, a subject they'd usually steer clear of, I reminded them, "You do realize that without my salary, this household would collapse. though it was more a confirmation to myself than a statement to them. Mrs. Whitmore scoffed. "We'll manage. We don't need your pity money." Yet Alex's silence revealed the truth. Their erratic behavior intensified, with Mrs. Whitmore fluctuating between sweet-talking me to stay and hurling insults when I didn't comply, while Alex seemed increasingly lost, his composed facade crumbling as his financial dependency became all too clear. One afternoon, I overheard their whispered conversation, chilling me to the bone. "She can't walk away from us like this," Alex hissed. Mrs. Whitmore's response was measured and calculating. "Don't worry, I have a plan. Make her life so miserable that she wouldn't dare leave." Overhearing their real intentions was an awakening. They cared not for me or even our son, but only for control and money. That night, as I lay in bed, a resolute plan began to form in my mind. They wanted a battle, and I would give them one. It wouldn't be with words or petty arguments. It would strike at their pride and pockets. The next morning, I moved my plan into action, contacting an attorney, an assertive, no-nonsense woman highly recommended for her sharp legal acumen. "I want a divorce, and I aim to ensure they don't receive a dime more than they deserve," I told her. She affirmed confidently, "We'll make that happen. Given that you've been the primary breadwinner, we'll leverage that." With each passing day, my resolve strengthened, cataloging everything: insults, financial manipulations, and the smallest grievances. As I built my case, a newfound empowerment filled me. For the first time in years, the shadows of fear lifted, a new dawn emerging with my reclaiming control over my destiny. As the divorce proceedings commenced, the household atmosphere grew progressively venomous, but with each day's passing, my fears dissipated, replaced by a steely resolve. One evening, Mrs. Whitmore attempted persuasion with an insincere sweetness. "Alara dear, why don't we set aside this nasty business? We're family, after all." I held her gaze steady. "Family doesn't treat each other as you've treated me." Alex, who had been observing quietly, interjected with scorn. "Oh, playing the victim now. You're not as innocent as you think." My anger surged, but I responded calmly. "I'm done being a scapegoat, Alex." Financial disputes were common, with Alex insisting, "You think you can just leave with our son? How will you support him?" I smiled, exuding confidence. "I've supported this family for years. I can manage." Mrs. Whitmore sneered. "You're nothing without us. You'll come crawling back." But their words no longer held power. A meeting with my lawyer revealed a well-strategized plan. "We'll highlight their dependence, emphasizing its importance in custody and asset division." As tension hit its peak at home, so did Mrs. Whitmore's desperation to undermine me. "You think you're so smart," she ridiculed, but I met her eyes unwavering. "I'm a woman finally standing up for herself." Alex's venom was swift. "You'll regret this. You can't survive without me." Yet his threats were powerless. My court preparations continued, with financial statements, abusive recordings, and negligence evidence piling up. As I gathered documents, my son, with uncertainty in his voice, asked, "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Embracing him protectively, I assured him, "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be fine. We're leaving this place, starting a new, happy life, just you and me." His comforting embrace reaffirmed my decision, fighting not just for myself, but for my son's future. The day of the court hearing approached, bringing with it a blend of fear and resolve. I was prepared to confront Alex and Mrs. Whitmore, ready to dismantle their control and emotional abuse. My goal was to reclaim my life and ensure my son's well-being. Justice was due, and my determination was unyielding. As the day finally arrived, I entered the courtroom, facing Alex and Mrs. Whitmore. A wave of surrealism washed over me. This was the moment everything would change. Proceedings began, marked by a cold, formal atmosphere. Alex's attorney painted him as a devoted husband and father mired in false allegations. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitmore donned the guise of a wronged, grieving mother-in-law. However, their deception was flimsy. When it was my turn to speak, I did so with clarity and composure, detailing my years as the sole provider amidst Alex's unemployment and his mother's manipulations. Interjecting, Alex feigned a wounded innocence. "Alara, how can you say these things? I've been supporting you." Without wavering, I countered, "Support is more than words, Alex. Your actions have only shown selfishness and cruelty." The judge absorbed every detail as I presented evidence: financial statements, abuse recordings, neighbors' testimonies. The undeniable truth began cracking Alex's calm exterior and Mrs. Whitmore's mask of innocence. The courtroom was tense as my lawyer unveiled proof of Alex's infidelity and Mrs. Whitmore's affair with a neighbor, Mr. Harwood. Gasps and murmurs spread as the damning images surfaced. Alex's face went pale, his shock evident. In anger, Mrs. Whitmore accused, "You invaded our privacy." Her voice was shrill, but I remained unwavering. "No, I revealed the truth you've hidden too long." Despite their protests, their reputation lay in ruins as the courtroom proceedings drew to a close. The judge granted me full custody of our child and a fair asset division. Alex and Mrs. Whitmore left with their reputation in tatters. Exiting the courtroom, I felt an immense weight lift. The years of manipulation and torment were over. I had triumphed over my oppressors. The most gratifying moment was when my son ran into my arms outside the courthouse. "We did it, Mom," he exclaimed with joy. "Yes, we did," I replied, holding him tightly. We were free, embarking on a future filled with hope. The fallout from the court ruling was swift and dramatic. The community buzzed with news of Alex and Mrs. Whitmore's deceit, stripping them of their respectable facade. While I focused on rebuilding life with my son, a sense of justice lingered, knowing they faced the consequences of their actions. An unexpected visit from Mrs. Harwood, the neighbor's wife, brought more clarity. Her eyes brimmed with unshed tears as she spoke of Mrs. Whitmore's betrayal. I listened, offering supportive words, acknowledging the deeper pain Mrs. Whitmore's actions caused. Days later, I encountered a defeated Alex in town. "Alara, can we talk?" he whispered. Looking at him, I asked, "What is there to discuss, Alex?" He admitted his over-reliance on my strength, though his apology was a testament to his newfound awareness of his faults, even if belated. Mrs. Whitmore, however, faced the severest repercussions. Her liaison with Mr. Harwood became a legal issue, as Mrs. Harwood sought divorce and a lawsuit for alienation of affection. Whispers about Mrs. Whitmore's plight painted a picture of her downfall. Once seen as a reputable figure, she became shunned, a social outcast due to her own actions. When I saw her at the grocery store, her defeated eyes met mine. "You did this to me," she hissed. Watching her walk away, I felt a mix of pity and vindication, thinking, "No, Sylvia, you did this to yourself." Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were now entangled in the very web of deceit they had spun. As I focused on my son and the new life we were building, I realized victory was not merely about revenge. It was liberation, a break from manipulation and emotional abuse. Looking forward to the future, I understood the best had yet to come.